Right. Well, thank you all so much for helping direct some of the conversation as far as focuses of the task force responsive to material shared by speakers. So we thank them once again, and we'll transition quickly then to our next session on broadband and 5G. And with that, we welcome two speakers for a moderated panel discussion. And so we welcome Anna Reed from the Pew Charitable Trust and Craig Rice representing the National Association of Counties National Broadband Task Force. So first to introduce Anna Reed, she leads Pew's efforts to examine how the federal government and states are working to connect millions of Americans to high-speed, reliable internet as part of the Trust Broadband Access Initiative. Her work focuses on research and promising practices that will help legislators and other policymakers expand connectivity and close the digital divide. Before joining Pew, Reed was a senior research associate at the American Planning Association, and she's also worked as a project manager on regional broadband planning efforts for Missouri's Office of Administration and for the International City County Management Association, where her work focused on smart growth in rural communities. Reed holds a bachelor's degree from Bryn Mawr College and a master's degree in regional planning from Cornell University. To introduce Craig Rice, Mr. Rice was elected in 2010 to the Montgomery County Council after previously having served in the Maryland House of Delegates from 2006 into 2010, where he was on the legislative body's Ways and Means Committee. Craig chairs the council's Education and Culture Committee and also serves on its Health and Human Services Committee. He's on the National Association Counties Board of Directors, Vice Chair for the Human Services and Education Steering Committee, and Co-Chair for the National Broadband Task Force to bridge the digital divide. In addition, he serves the council's representative to the Maryland Association of Counties in Annapolis and chairs the Education Subcommittee for that association. Craig is the past chair and current member of the Metropolitan Washington Council of Governments, Chesapeake Bay and Water Resources Policy Committee, and is co-chair of their Food and Agricultural Regional Member Ad Hoc Advisory Committee. He's also served on the Maryland Commission on Innovation and Excellence in Education. And so with that, we welcome both Anna and Craig to the conversation. So to start things off, want to first ask Craig to tell us a little bit more about the NECA Broadband Task Force that you co-chair. Who's involved with this effort and what are the objectives of the task force?
Well, thank you, Carl, for that very long introduction. I always tell my staff to keep it very short, just Craig Rice. Care about people and want to see things happen. And that's really where the emphasis for this task force came from. Gary Moore, who is the president of NACO, was actually the one who, in consultation with many of us throughout the nation, said we need to have a task force dedicated, understanding what we saw, the challenges with COVID exacerbated, the digital divide, the challenges that we continued to see when it came to broadband access and equity for all folks throughout our communities across this country. And the reality is this, is that whether you care about education, whether you care about commerce, whether you care about healthcare, it doesn't matter what it is that you care about, they're all connected to broadband. And I use that pun very seriously because it is something in which when we look at telemedicine, when we look at e-commerce and what's going on in economic development, when we look at what's happening in the education space, folks were navigating towards this area and arena anyway, to where we knew that things were migrating online. And so then to have us thrown into this lurch, but not be prepared, certainly has now ramped up the impetus for us to get things done. And that means working with our federal government and state government partners to make sure that as localities, we continue to serve the needs of our community, many of which who have been left behind and continue to be left behind throughout this pandemic and recession that we find ourselves in. And so it's imperative for us to make changes. And we can do that with partners that are on this call, with all of us as local, state, and national elected leaders, as well as those who are in the industry throughout the community. We all stand to benefit if we have greater connectivity. And so that's why this is so important and why we need to get this done. So the task force comprised of 24 individuals, which are elected leaders from across the country. We actually combined them into 4 different subcommittees, one that was preparing for broadband, barriers to build out, digital divides and digital equity, and future-proofing the economy. So those were the four subcommittees, and they each had 3 directives: develop short, medium, or intermediate and long-term goals. And so we'll get into more of that discussion, but that gives you a brief overview of how this came about and what the Broadband Task Force was comprised of and challenged with.
Thank you. Next question, I'm going to move to Anna. Could you share with us information on the Broadband Access Initiative at Pew, and what is the mission of the initiative? What resources are already available to states?
Sure. So the Pew Charitable Trust is a nonprofit, nonpartisan research institution that focuses on complex policy challenges. And one of the areas we've been focusing on over the last several years is broadband and how to expand broadband access across the country. And specifically, we've been focusing on the role of states and how states are engaging in addressing gaps in broadband and the activities they're undertaking in order to close those gaps. So the overall mission of the Broadband Access Initiative is to increase access to broadband infrastructure through state and now additionally federal policy. We have a number of resources available related to how states have been addressing broadband, and I'll add some links to the chat. We started a few years ago by looking across all 50 states and what policies are in place. And we have a state broadband policy explorer that allows you to see and compare how different states have addressed broadband through policy, including, establishing offices, establishing broadband funds, removing barriers to broadband expansion, and so forth. We also have some in-depth case studies on what states have done, on focusing specifically on 9 states that have active broadband programs, and how they've been working to address both the infrastructure side and in some states as well, the adoption component. And then we recently put together a set of questions and answers with state broadband programs and other experts who really, provide great insight into what is going on in their communities. So those are some of the resources that we have. And again, I'll go ahead and add those to the chat.
Thank you.
Great. And to build off of that, and to first get a sense of where we've been and what progress has been made, and then what work is left to be done, I was wondering if one or both of you could kind of help explain some of the progress that we've made leading up to this moment, but what's left and what really should states be focusing in on.
Anna, did you want to go first?
Sure, I can get started on that one. So over the last few years, states have really taken an active role in addressing the broadband challenge. Nearly all states now have some form of broadband program, and over half have broadband funds. And so at the state level, we've really seen active efforts to particularly address broadband in rural and unserved areas, to provide grants that help create the necessary business case or return on investment for providers to extend service or improve service in areas that do not currently have it. So while we've seen a lot of progress on the infrastructure side, there's still a lot of challenges on the broadband adoption side. And that's something where we haven't seen as much activity at the state or federal levels related to both addressing the affordability challenge when people have infrastructure available to them and do not subscribe because the monthly cost is too high, as well as the digital literacy component. So where people aren't able to use the technology and therefore do not see a reason to connect. So a lot has been done, but there is a lot of work that remains to be done.
Yeah, and so what we've seen is that states and the federal government, quite honestly, but mainly states, need to take very seriously this initiative around broadband access and equity, and not just assign it to a person who has other responsibilities. We need to see offices of digital inclusion, digital equity, whatever they may be, established. And we need to have a person whose sole role and responsibility it is to work with state legislators and stakeholders to create better opportunities for local government, state, and national to all work together to get this job done, to get us across the finish line. We've made great progress. There have been a lot of a lot of local jurisdictions that have gone with dig once policies. We've seen investment at the state level when it comes to investing in infrastructure and working with local governments and municipal broadband. Those kinds of things have happened. We've seen digital literacy movements happen, but they've been ad hoc and very piecemeal. What we need to do is have a concerted strategy that brings everyone together, that says, yes, indeed, we are focused on this. This is our mission, and we're going to accomplish it. And so I think starting with that as one of the lead-ins to make sure that every state across this country has an office that's set up with a person who's in leadership, who has the trust of their governor, their state government, and quite honestly, has relationships with local governments to be able to start enacting some of these policies that we know are tried and true and are going to make a difference to help that to move forward. And so that's one of the biggest asks that we have. There are much more detailed things that we're asking for as a part of this Broadband Task Force recommendations that should be coming out shortly in the next couple of weeks. But that's where it starts. It starts with that commitment.
Thank you both for sharing. We look forward to seeing that report, and we'll certainly be sharing that with the members of this subcommittee. Anna, you mentioned vouchers and affordability, and studies have shown that some people have access to broadband technically, but simply don't subscribe. So I wanted to see if both of you would tell us what you know about those individuals. What notable programs or recommendations do you have around initiatives such as voucher programs to support affordability?
Sure. So we know a few things. One, research that's been conducted both by our colleagues at the Pew Research Center and by the California Emerging Technology Fund has shown cost as a major barrier to adoption. So where people have access to the infrastructure and are not subscribing, it's often due to that monthly cost of the connection. There is not a lot of great data on pricing, so I can't speak so much to what those prices look like across the country, but we do know that that's a barrier. Additionally, we know that people who do not have a home broadband subscription are more likely to be low income, older, or non-white. So our colleagues at the Pew Research Center, again, have done a lot of research on this over the years. And while you've seen an upward trend across all of the demographic groups that they look at, you still see gaps related to age. So about 64% of adults age 65 or over have a home broadband subscription compared to 86% of adults in the 30 to 49 age group. When you look at race, about 80% of white adults have a home broadband subscription, and that compares to 71% of Black adults and 65% of Hispanic adults. And the numbers are a little different than what you'll see in the American Community Survey, which looks at the household level rather than, so very specifically breaking out like adults versus households. Income then is one of the greatest divides there, which also aligns with people citing cost as a barrier to adoption. 92% of adults with incomes above $75,000 a year have a home broadband subscription compared to just 57% of adults with incomes below $30,000 a year. So that's a pretty substantial gap. In terms of some of the solutions to address this component of the challenge and to help get people online, there are a few different models, and there's definitely more research that is needed into each of those models. So you have some of the existing low-cost offers provided by internet service providers, the $10 a month subscriptions. And in some cases, a school district or another community partner may pay that fee, so it's free to the subscribing household. You have programs that are more of a subsidy program, like the current emergency broadband benefit, where there's a monthly amount that's paid to the internet service provider to connect the household. And then you still have at both the state and the federal level, the more traditional Lifeline program, which is also kind of a subsidy program, but different than the emergency broadband benefit. So again, we don't have a lot of examples and a lot of data at this point on some of the newer efforts, especially the emergency broadband benefit and some of the state efforts during the pandemic. But there's a lot to be learned about, how to connect households who are not currently connected.
So I don't have a lot to add beyond what Anna said, because she pretty much covered it all. Let me just say this, that part of this is about digital literacy as well, and making sure that folks understand that you don't know until you know that you need to have this, and you need to have this connectivity. It is not just about having a person connected, but it's actually having a person connected at speed that we know is going to be conducive to supporting what it is that they're looking to do. Many of the providers to this point have provided very low cost and low speed alternatives for folks. Well, if you're a single mom who's got 3 kids at home and they're all on Zoom, you've already exceeded what the standard that they're giving you for that low cost alternative is. And so therefore, you're actually still having the same connectivity problems that you had before you even had the service come in the house. And so it's actually doing a disservice by making it seem as though folks are connected when they're truly not. That's the reason why part of our recommendations are advocating for more accurate data in terms of data mapping of what people are getting in terms of speeds. It's the reason why NACO adopted the Test IT app. And I encourage all of you to go onto your app stores, whether it's Apple or via Google, and take a look, download that Test IT app. It will actually give us information wherever you are as to what download speeds are. We have to adopt a better standard. The reality is that the standard that we have now, a minimum, is not conducive with what it is that we're seeing. We need more. We need more data. We truly need a 100 up, 100 down system that is there for everyone. That truly gives households what they need to support all of the different things that we know in this day and age is required to have true connectivity. And so from that perspective, it's not just about the affordability, but it's about the quality of that signal and what's coming into the house and able to support what it is that they're looking for. So those two things go hand in hand, the affordability and the quality of that connection.
Thank you.
Moving on to more specifically 5G, we know that 15% of Americans rely on smartphones as their primary means to access the internet. So what is your all's take on the challenges and opportunities that 5G continues to present, and what are those policy implications for states? For whoever wants to take that question first.
So I'll just jump in because here in my own home county, we have a bill right now that's dealing with 5G. That continues to advance 5G with the FCC standards that we've seen, because throughout a lot of counties across this nation, there are restrictions that are currently in place that don't allow for 5G small cell towers to be built in a lot of neighborhoods. And so it's zoning restrictions. And so it's educating our local elected leaders about the need for broadband access, for that 5G access that's there. We have actually cleared for commercial. And so we've already put a ZTA in place, that a zoning text amendment that allows for that broadband, those 5G small cell towers to be built on commercial property. We currently have one that's before the council right now dealing with residential property. And so we hope to see those move forward, because we know the solution is not just via broadband. There are some areas where broadband is not going to be feasible. I represent our agricultural reserve here in Montgomery County. And so out here, there are no question that when you're sitting on 200 acres of land, for us to build a broadband connection just for your household is cost prohibitive. But there are other methods that we can use as well. So whether it's using the small cell towers via 5G, whether it's using some of the satellite technology that you see that Elon Musk and Tesla are investing in, and others, there's so many other ways in which we can continue to promote connectivity with our brand new sorts of technology. And so that's the future proofing that we talked about within the Broadband Task Force. And part of it is heavy reliance upon 5G, understanding that that will make a difference in some cases. Again, it should not be the rubber stamp always, yes, we'll give you 5G instead of broadband. It should only be used as an enhancement, and for those areas that we know really can't be served via broadband technology, but it is something that across the board we need as a part of our robust solution strategy when it comes to connectivity all across the board.
I guess one of the things I would note, since you framed it in terms of the percentage of Americans who are smartphone dependent, is that 5G as a technology or as a standard might not address some of the other barriers that come along with depending on a smartphone for your primary mode of connecting to the internet. So whether that be the data caps that are often in place on mobile plans that limit usage to a significantly smaller amount of data per month than you see on wired connections, or whether that be the device that you're using and some of the limitations around what can and can't be done when a smartphone is your primary device. Those are considerations as well related to 5G and mobile usage. And additionally, 5G networks are fiber intensive. And so, we do just like to highlight that it is a technology. It's a technology that will work well in some places, and it is the next generation standard of wireless technology. However, again, it requires a fairly robust underlying fiber network, which will present some of the same challenges that you see in current broadband deployment patterns.
Thank you both. Next question is around what can municipalities and states do to incentivize private sector investment in both 5G and broadband?
So I'm going to jump in on this one as a local elected official and just say this. Oftentimes, we're always tasked with incentivization instead of actually going with requirements. And I think that in this case, we actually have to be a bit more aggressive than just saying it's only about incentivization. And I'm not saying that the question said that, but that's oftentimes where we often get kind of pigeonholed in that, okay, so how do we incentivize private sector to invest and to make these kinds of changes? The reality is this, is that public policy is what got us into this challenge when it comes to our digital divide. And the only way out of it is via public policy. And so that means that we're actually going to have to pass laws, and we're going to have to set policy that says that we're going to treat broadband access like a utility, like we do with everything else, whether it's water or electricity, and mandate that there is connectivity that is there for folks. I mean, if this is a priority for us, if we are serious about what it is that we're trying to do, which is to ensure that every American across this country can have the connectivity to broadband that we know is essential for education, healthcare, commerce, all of the things that we know are so important, then we have to treat it as such. And so that means, while yes, we do want to understand where private companies are coming from, when it is one in which, yes, we have to understand their business bottom line. But at the same time, if this is a priority for us, we also have to make sure that they are where the rubber meets the road. And we're going to have to start telling our giants like Comcast and others that are out there that we need to have our providers at the table with us, and also figuring out ways in which they can make this happen. It is not just going to fall on the backs of local, state, or the federal government to fund this. It has got to be something that we're all in together.
Yeah, I would echo what Craig said related to it requires all levels of government and investment and policy at all levels of government. In terms of what states have been doing and what has been working to facilitate investment in those particularly rural and unserved areas has been creating state level broadband programs. And obviously the funding is a very important component of that, providing those grants to support deployment. But those programs also play important roles related to supporting or facilitating planning activities at the local level, as well as bringing stakeholders together. So particularly providers and communities, and helping facilitate some of those conversations or spark some of those partnerships that are necessary to extending service into currently unserved areas.
Great, thank you. And to move back to a topic that Craig had brought up earlier about, what are some of those minimum acceptable speeds for broadband? And so I want to get Anna's take on that question as far as what maybe she's seeing across states on how that conversation is playing out, and what is that minimum threshold that states are commonly taking a look at?
So there are a couple different thresholds that we see with states, but we have seen, I would say, all of them increasing over the 3 years that we have looked at this. So the first is how states define unserved areas, or those that are either eligible or prioritized for funding. And many states now fall around a 25.3 standard for that. So, the federal definition of broadband. Previously, over the last few years, that has increased. States were, and there are still a few that do, using a 10.1 standard. So places that didn't meet any level of broadband were the ones that were eligible. And then you were ending up sometimes with kind of gaps, which can still happen with the 25.3 program, between the areas that you funded and the areas that were eligible for funding. So there's the unserved definition, and then there's the what states are funding to, and the standard that they're requiring grant recipients to meet with the projects that they build. And increasingly, states are looking at a scalable to standard. So the technology might not, or the project might not meet that standard today, but they have to be able to, or the state kind of funds the component that does, if there's, for example, a fixed wireless element included in like a primarily fiber network. So more states are now using a scalable to 100/100 standard. And then several states that have just recently established broadband programs have kind of skipped over that unserved definition altogether and said, we're funding projects that can provide 100 megabits per second. So any area that doesn't have 110 or 120 is eligible for funding. So those are a few different types of the different standards. So what can be funded and what you're funding to. And I saw a question related to the underserved areas as well. And that's definitely a challenge. Some states define those, some states don't. But they tend to kind of be deprioritized in that funding scheme, even if they're funding setup, even if they're technically eligible to receive grants, because the number of unserved areas that remain is still very high.
Did you have anything else to add there, Council Member?
Yes. Thank you. And I apologize, but this is really, really important because as a representative of one of our underserved and sometimes, unfortunately, unserved areas throughout this county, it is one in which I think that there's going to be a twofold solution. One of them has got to be in mandating that if companies want to do business in our area, they're going to have to play a partner role. Doesn't always mean that you have to be the one, but playing a partner role in terms of ensuring that those are connected. Because here's the other challenge, and this is the other part of it, is that we also need to support municipal broadband. There are 22 states throughout the United States. I'm not going to call them out because I don't want to put anybody on blast here, but there are 22 states that actually restrict municipal broadband. And all that does is protect internet service providers that are already out there, these broadband companies that refuse to invest in some of these areas and don't want to put their money where their mouth is, but then want to continue to say that, well, we're setting up a small program that's going to help some of the underserved, but that's for places where there already is broadband, where it's an affordability issue and not a connectivity issue. And so oftentimes what happens is our folks in rural jurisdictions are the ones who are oftentimes left behind. It is the folks who actually get a little bit of connectivity because we make it a little bit affordable for a lower cost tier product. But it is those folks. And so we have to push on both levels. So it's allowing municipalities to step in. It is really that when you look at that middle mile that's there, it needs to be an open network. So there's open competitiveness that's there. No one should have a stronghold on that particular part. And we all know that competitiveness breeds price reduction and better service. And so from that perspective, that is where we need our federal government and our state partners to come in and start passing laws that allow for us to do this. Because I promise you, if local broadband, municipal broadband was allowed across this country, you would start seeing these crop up and you'd start seeing these companies saying, wait a minute, as a part of our business model, we need to invest and figure out ways to make this happen. So Lieutenant Governor, your question is one of the biggest things that we're talking about right now, and is something that if we are going to ensure that we have that connectivity that's there for some of our harder to serve areas, we have got to push this aspect of it. And that means being forceful. It does not mean asking, it means insisting. And there is a big difference in that. And that makes people feel uncomfortable. I've been on the call with some of our big providers. I know them well. I respect them. But at the same time, if we are to get what we're trying to get done, we've got to start pushing folks in uncomfortable positions. And that's one of them.
Thank you. So one final question before we go to our break and then come back for discussion with Craig and Anna. How are states best leaning in to the opportunity that exists with federal monies to support broadband expansion, and any suggestions to states on how to best leverage these resources?
Sure, I can start with that one. You know, there is significantly more federal funding to support broadband available than there has been in recent memory, and both with the coronavirus relief funds last year, which, you know, didn't specifically address broadband, but were used for broadband in many states, as well as the American Rescue Plan funding. States have more input in that funding and how it can be used for broadband deployment than they have with previous sources of federal funding, such as the FCC's Rural Digital Opportunity Fund or the USDA's Reconnect program. So a number of states, starting with the Coronavirus Relief Fund, took a fairly large portion of that money and allocated it towards broadband expansion, both looking towards those short-term needs, such as hotspots or providing public access points, as well as longer-term investments in infrastructure, either through their existing grant programs or emergency grant programs. States are also beginning to commit some of the state and local funding through the American Rescue Plan to broadband expansion, sometimes in combination with state funding. The ARPA funds have a longer timeline on them. So the role of sort of planning at the state level and supporting some of that planning and engagement at the local level in order to facilitate the use of those funds is really critical, as well as, you know, for states that do not currently have a broadband program, which very few, but not all of them, have full-time dedicated staff. So getting that in place and ensuring that, you know, the programs do have the capacity necessary to support the activities that they will be carrying out with the available funding.
Yeah, and so I'll just be brief because I know that we're close on time. So federal policy on grant programs associated with broadband deployment need to stipulate that the grant money is there on a reimbursable process. And that's to allow for us to make sure that the ISPs actually deliver speeds that they're promising and that we know are necessary for connectivity. And we've got to
Craig, I think we're losing your audio here.
This is exactly what happens. This is exactly why, unfortunately. Do you have me now, Carl?
Yes, we do. Okay,
sorry. Like I said, I'm in a rural area. So unfortunately, it's one of those where you get to see firsthand what happens. But a clearinghouse of the grant strictly focused on the deployment and installation of broadband functionality has to be there, along with tutorials on best practices for broadband community grants. That is essential. Essentially, what we need to do is make sure that the grants are actually doing what we want them to do, and that's to expand broadband access, make sure that it truly is ramping up in terms of giving us the deliverables that we need with both speed and latency, and requiring that before we distribute any money. That's imperative. And then just last but not least, you know, it's got to be peer review mapping. So we have to have a check and balance that's there to make sure that this happens. And of course, obviously, when it comes to these investments, they need to focus and prioritize on those unserved areas first, and then get to our underserved. So there should be a policy in place that allows for us to focus on unserved and then underserved, understanding that some connectivity is still better than no connectivity at all. So we need to prioritize that when it comes to where we're giving our grants to.
Okay, great. So we are about out of time. So want to thank Craig and Anna so much for the valuable information you provided. So we're going to take our final break of the day and reconvene at the top of the hour. And so we hope that Craig and Anna can stick around to see if there's any questions specifically from our task force members after they've had a chance to digest some of that information and give us an opportunity to hear what's going on in their state in particular and some of the opportunities that may exist that we can share out with our fellow task force members. So we'll be back here in about 10 minutes. Thank you.